Okay, so it's 2 o'clock. We'll start. As always, I have 50 minutes. I'm not planning on going over 50 minutes. If I do, the second I hit 50 minutes, you're free to go. You're not my prisoner. But until that second comes, please don't pack up, because there's quite a few of us in here, and if just a small number of you start packing up early, it makes a lot of noise and causes disruption, okay? So the second I go over, I failed at my job and you can leave, but until then, just give me the time, please. Okay, so this unit in 203 is called The Enlightenment and Its Critics, and we're reading three authors, Immanuel Kant, Nicolas de Condorcet, and Herder, Johann Gottfried Herder. Has anyone read Kant in here before? Okay, a couple of you. Condorcet, not as widely read, probably not, and Herder, I'm guessing none as well. Okay, so for some of us, we'll be getting into new territory with Kant. For all of us, we'll be getting into new territory with Condorcet and Herder. Kant and Condorcet here are kind of the archetypal representatives of Enlightenment thought, okay? And Herder is going to be our critic in the unit Enlightenment and Its Critics. And just to give a little bit of background with basic terms before we get into their thinking. What was the Enlightenment? Okay, sometimes described as the Age of Enlightenment. This is the period that we're going to be focusing on for this unit. I assume a lot of you have probably encountered the Enlightenment before in history classes, something like this. Okay, I'm going to start off with as general of a possible definition of the Age of Enlightenment or the Enlightenment as I can. This is a period of Western European history that's characterized by a modern philosophical movement. Okay, so now we have lots of questions that we need to answer. What is the time period we're talking about in Western European history, for example? The answer to that question is going to depend partly upon what historian you're reading, okay? So any history of the Enlightenment, definitely the 18th century, 1700s is going to be central to this period, okay? So this is the century of the Enlightenment, the 1700s, and we're talking about a philosophical movement that's taking place in countries like the UK, the Netherlands, especially the city of Amsterdam, France, territories that we would now call Germany, at this time called Prussia, okay? When does this period begin? This is where you'll get some difference among historians. Some might broadly identify the Enlightenment with the 18th century. Some might place the beginnings earlier in, let's say, the mid-17th century in cities like Amsterdam, where we saw Descartes was living for a large part of his life, right? Some might place it even a little earlier, going back to like the UK and works of thinkers like Locke. Generally, the kind of consensus conventional endpoint for the Age of Enlightenment or the Enlightenment is the French Revolution, because this is when we see a social movement that's inspired by Enlightenment ideas that ends in lots of social unrest and lots of fighting and bloodshed and arbitrary executions and things that horrify many people, as far as I had no idea that the Enlightenment could lead to these devastating results, right? So you start to see this new perception on Enlightenment ideas after the French Revolution. So roughly speaking, this is the time period we're talking about. What kind of philosophical movement are we talking about that's inspiring this time period? Well, in a lot of ways, the Enlightenment thinkers are going to be sort of intensifying and thinking through the ideas of modern philosophy that we've already been encountering this semester, okay? So we started off reading Copernicus, who's early or maybe even pre-modern, and then we got into Bacon and Descartes and Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. Can we say anything about why we would call these thinkers modern? Anything at all? Not a single thing? I was totally afraid of this when I asked the question. But if you can't answer the question, then perhaps it's worth reviewing. No ideas what might set these people apart from the thinkers, scientists, philosophers, however you want to categorize them, that came before them. Karim? Sorry? They're critical of the church. Okay, perhaps that's so. I mean, I don't know if that's like a strong theme we saw in Bacon or in Descartes even, right? But we certainly saw, like in my class, we read Galileo, and we saw how this brought him into conflict with the church, the attempts to defend the heliocentric model, okay? Other ideas? What makes thinker modern? Yeah. They're trying to go against the ideas of before, you're saying. Okay, this is maybe when we're getting towards a definitive sort of theme in modern thought. Going back to like Bacon and Descartes, for example, we see them both like invested in this idea of rejecting all forms of prejudice, right? Rejecting all ideas that we take as true simply because people have held them previously, simply because we've inherited them, right? So we have this wholesale rejection of prejudice. This is going to be a theme that's carried through by the Enlightenment thinkers. So we could call this maybe a commitment to critical thought, right? If you are going to tell me that a claim is true, you are going to have to justify its truth through some combination of evidence and argument, right? You can't simply claim it's true because it's been believed before, or because we've inherited, or because someone important or learned said it in the past, okay? So they're going to inherit this wholesale rejection of prejudice, the commitment to critical thought, like we've seen in previous works. This is also what's going on in Hobbes and Locke, right? They're rejecting inherited ideas about political authority, morality. They're starting to what? Begin all over again from the beginning, right? The state of nature, what human beings would have been like, and what morality, what politics we can derive from that state, okay? So in these thinkers, we also see a commitment to systematic thinking. You see this same pattern again and again when we looked at Copernicus, Hobbes, Descartes, Locke, Rousseau, Locke, maybe not Rousseau so much. You see this pattern where people are trying to begin from scratch to establish true beliefs by some kinds of what they call basically true beliefs, whether they call them first notions or first principles or basic laws, right? We're going to establish a true foundation of beliefs, and from this true foundation, we're going to derive or infer to all of our other true beliefs, right? This is the kind of systematic picture of knowledge that, going all the way back to Copernicus, we saw was something he desired, right? This was one of his problems with the Ptolemaic model. You had to use all these different ad hoc, arbitrary principles to explain many aspects of planetary motion. He thought his system was better because he can explain all these aspects with just one idea, that the Earth itself is in motion, okay? So we're going to see a continued commitment to systematic thought, and we're going to see a commitment to, like we saw in Locke especially, a commitment to human equality and natural rights, okay? And one thing that's a little funny about this period that's often called the Age of Enlightenment is, I don't know how common it is to have a historical period that we remember or characterize by a philosophical movement. Philosophy is usually not that important to get a historical period named after it, right? We usually recognize historical periods by the technology that was available, or the economic circumstances that people were suffering through, or maybe we look at the regime that was in power, or the wars that were being fought, right? Here we're looking at philosophy, and the reason is, this is one of the maybe rare cases where philosophy has huge social repercussions and creates great historical changes, okay? Most notably, things like inspiring the American and French revolutions. These are revolutions that are inspired by the idea of basic human equality, the ideas of natural rights that we saw espoused by John Locke earlier, okay? If we were to read the US Declaration of Independence, or if we were to read the French Declaration of the Rights of Human Beings and of Citizens, we'll see these ideas of natural rights being expressed there. Not only are these documents important for the people at this time period, but these are still documents that hold force legally and morally for many people today, right? So this is why philosophy matters so much in the 18th century, okay? French Enlightenment philosophers, like those who were making the encyclopedia at the time, called it the century of philosophy. Now, my definition here is super vague, almost to the point of being useless, and I did that on purpose. I did that because I think a lot of times when you read about the Enlightenment, either when you read people who are celebrating the great accomplishments of the Enlightenment, or they're disparaging the Enlightenment for all of the terrible stuff that it brought upon the world, they usually have this super simplistic, naive definition of what the Enlightenment was. They usually describe the Enlightenment as one thing, and then they celebrate that one thing, or they tell you about how that one thing was so awful. And that's definitely not the idea that I want you to have about the Enlightenment when you're done with this class. Just like how I haven't wanted you to have that idea about science or about reason or about human nature, right? The whole time we've been looking at how people are debating these concepts, right? How we're looking at people who have different ideas of what science is or what reason is or what human nature is. These concepts are always being debated, argued about, negotiated, and the same thing is happening in the 18th century with this concept of enlightenment. So what I want to do is look at Kant, Condorcet, and Herder's writings and try to get an idea how they understood enlightenment. What did they take it to be? What did they think was happening in their society as it was becoming, quote unquote, enlightened? Okay? So I want to distinguish between the Enlightenment, right, with a capital E, which is what we're talking about when we mention this historical period, right? That is the Enlightenment. I want to distinguish between that and lowercase e Enlightenment, okay? If we look back at 18th century texts like Kant, Condorcet, Herder, we're not going to see these thinkers talking about the Enlightenment with a capital E. They're living in the midst of this period. They have no concept of this period coming to a close at some point. They can't look back with it in hindsight and recognize how it's different from what comes later, right? So they don't recognize they're in the middle of the age of enlightenment, but they do recognize that there's something changing around them in society. And they call this process enlightenment, right, with a lowercase e. Or they'll say that people are becoming enlightened, or that certain forms of thinking are enlightened, okay? And that's what I'm interested in exploring here. What did they take this process to be, right, when people were becoming enlightened? And if we pay close attention, I think we'll see that they have different ideas of what enlightenment refers to. One thing that they all agree upon, I think we can say safely, is enlightenment is a process that's happening now that is particular to their societies in Western Europe, okay? So Herder, Kant, Condorcet, they all recognize this, okay? Where they'll differ is what exactly this process entails, or what makes someone enlightened. So I want to start off by looking at Condorcet's text. It's called The Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. So Condorcet is writing this text in very difficult circumstances. He's actually in hiding. He's on the run from the French government. There's a warrant out for his arrest. He's a supporter of the French Revolution. He actually works up the first draft constitution, which wasn't ultimately used for the new French Republic. But he becomes critical of the people who end up taking power during the French Revolution. And as a result, they regard him as a rebel. So they issue a warrant for his arrest, and he has to go into hiding, okay? And while he's in hiding, he decides to write this book. And this book is basically a huge project. He's going to write this history of humanity as a whole, right? Focusing on the ways in which thinking or the mind has developed or progressed over time. On the one hand, this seems like an insane project to take up when you're hiding in a friend's basement from the authorities, okay? Partly he's doing this because he's wanted to write this book for a long time. He's had a plan to write a book like this for a couple decades, okay? So maybe he recognizes this is his last chance, okay? Also, we're going to see in his last chapter, what he does there is he doesn't talk about the present or the past. He actually talks about the future, what he calls the 10th era, right? The next era of humanity. And what he's doing there is he's predicting how history is going to continue to unfold after this great period of enlightening. And the reason why that chapter is important for him, and I think it's the reason why he chose to write this book at this time, is because it's supposed to give proponents of the Enlightenment a vision of hope in very dark times. And he's living in the darkest times, hiding in his friend's basement. He ends up finally getting arrested and put in jail. And within a couple days, he dies in jail. It's not clear how. Maybe he was poisoned. Maybe a friend gave him poison so that he didn't have to go through the humiliation of a public execution. We're not clear. But he ends up suffering quite a bit due to the French Revolution, yet he wants to hold out this vision of hope. So for Condorcet, he says the most enlightened era that humanity has ever seen is the one that he's living in. This is what he calls the ninth era. So he divides human history into a period of 9 different eras. And our readings cover his 8th era, his 9th era, and his 10th era. Okay? So the 9th era, this is where we see human beings at their most enlightened. This is where we see these great changes of enlightenment taking place in society. And Condorcet isn't kind enough to define the word enlightenment for us. It would be nice if he did, if he had like a glossary or something like that. He didn't do that. So what are we going to do if we want to figure out what he meant by enlightenment? Well, we need to pay close attention to the sentences where he uses the word enlightenment and see what he says, right, related to the word. So I pulled out a couple passages that I thought were interesting here. And you have the page numbers that correspond to your packet. So the first quote from Condorcet, he says, "All men have equal right to be enlightened, to know all truths regarding their interests." Okay? So it looks like in this kind of parenthetical phrase, although there's no parentheses, it looks like here he's telling us what he means by being enlightened. To be enlightened is to know all truths. Okay? And I think this is a helpful clue when you pay attention to how he uses the word enlightened or enlightenment. It does seem to have to do with the state of possessing knowledge. One is enlightened when they possess knowledge, or one is becoming enlightened when they're in the process of acquiring knowledge. Okay? I think this is especially true in the next passage. So this is a longer passage, but bear with me a moment. He's talking about the 9th era, his era here. Okay? He says, "In the 9th era, the new truths with which genius had enriched philosophy, politics, and public economy, adopted more or less by enlightened men, extended still further their salutary influence." Okay? So he's telling us something that happened in the 9th century. Philosophers had introduced new truths. Okay? And these new truths are extending their influence. So he says, "Accordingly, although there were still many men condemned to a voluntary or forced ignorance, the line between mankind's thick-headed portion and its enlightened portion was almost entirely erased, leaving only a gradual slope from the height of genius to the depths of stupidity." Okay? So the thick-headed portion and the genius philosophers, you know how smart philosophers are, they're geniuses, right? This difference is becoming much less than in previous eras. Okay? And this is the sentence I want to focus on. Notice this is a crazy sentence that I'm about to show you. Okay, there's going to be a huge dash with many, 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 many words, and then it's going to finally finish on the last line. The whole rest of that paragraph is one sentence. Don't write like this. This is terrible writing. Okay. He says, "Thus these things, dash." Skip all that dashing and go to the very end of the sentence. "Thus these things passed, a little at a time, from the writings of the philosophers into every class of society." So here, in between these dashes, he's going to be basically telling us what he thinks of these new truths to be that philosophers have introduced in the 9th era and that have been passed on to the masses. Okay? Great. Now we get some clear content what he means by enlightenment. So these are the things that philosophers have introduced. A general knowledge of the natural rights of man. The opinion that these rights aren't given and can't be taken away. A strongly expressed demand for freedom of thinking and writing, freedom of industry and commerce. Relief of the people's distress, repeal of penal laws against religious dissidents, abolition of torture and cruel punishments, the desire for a milder system of criminal legislation, jurisprudence giving complete security to innocence, a civil code that is simpler and more in harmony with reason and nature, lack of bias in favor of any religion, with all of them being classified as superstitions or political tricks. Okay? So it seems like most of these new truths that he's interested in, appears to me, are both moral and legal, right? Recognition of the natural rights that all human beings have, the kinds of rights that John Locke talked about, right? Recognizing that governments need to protect these rights. And we also see a special kind of, I don't know if hatred's the right word, but let's say disrespect of religion coming from Condorcet here, right? The Enlightened man recognizes that religions are all just political tricks, okay? Here's one distinction between Condorcet and other Enlightenment thinkers. Not all Enlightenment thinkers would have agreed with him here, okay? Immanuel Kant would not have, for example. Others would have, but this is an example of different ideas of enlightenment, okay? So he's giving us this idea of enlightenment, meaning the state of possessing knowledge or the process of acquiring knowledge, right? Seems like he's mostly focused here on moral and legal knowledge based on this idea of natural rights. When did the ninth era start for Condorcet? He would say it started just about where we're saying modern philosophy started, okay? He says it starts with the works of Bacon and Galileo and Descartes and John Locke. Bacon, he says, taught us to reject all prejudice and to only accept beliefs that were based on observation and experiment. Does that sound like Bacon to you? It's a pretty good summary, okay? But the problem with Bacon, Condorcet says, is although he talked a lot about deriving true beliefs from observation and experiment, his scientific method was not very successful. He wasn't able to really show us how to do this. And if you remember anything about the tables of experience or the tables of discovery, you have an idea what he's talking about, okay? Galileo, now here's the guy who perfected the scientific method. So he showed us how to use experiments and calculation in order to establish true beliefs. This became a very productive method for arriving at knowledge. The only problem is Galileo only really applied his techniques to physics and to mathematics. So it's really Descartes, Condorcet wants to say, who inspired an entire generation to only accept the beliefs that reason will endorse, okay? Another idea that we've already seen, right, in this class. Descartes inspired a generation to only accept the beliefs that reason will endorse, but unfortunately, Condorcet says, at the same time, Descartes introduced lots of confusing and false ideas into his philosophy. Any guess what confusing or false ideas Descartes may have introduced into his philosophy according to Condorcet? Karim? Huh? Aspects of God, the existence of God, the idea that the second principle that we're going to base all knowledge on is that God exists. If you're the kind of guy who thinks that religion is always a political trick, you probably won't think that's the best system of knowledge, right? So this is why Condorcet especially values Locke. Locke was an empiricist, which meant Locke said we can only have knowledge of things that we can experience. And this, Condorcet thinks, was a useful tool for sidestepping any kinds of religious controversies. Controversies about God's existence or God's aspects, these are people who are just interpreting the Bible however they like. They have no experience to really guarantee their knowledge, so we can ignore those disputes. When priests are talking about what God commands us to do and how this is right, they don't actually have moral knowledge. Instead, if we want to look towards moral knowledge, we want to recognize the one principle that all morality is based upon, right? This is when we have a science of morality for Condorcet. And for Condorcet, all morality is based upon one foundation, and that is the idea that human beings are naturally equal. And this is an idea that he could have found in Locke, right? Locke begins the two treatises that we're reading with this observation. And Locke tells us that this observation is self-evident. We simply recognize that we're all members of the same species with the same faculties. Therefore, we're equal. So this is the basis of morality. And this is when we have a science of morality. Of course, there were people who were arguing about what's right and wrong behavior prior to Locke, prior to the ninth era. Why do you think Condorcet is saying this is when the science of morality begins? Why would previous accounts of morality not be scientific? Wafi? They weren't applied? I think moral systems tend to have lots of effects on the general public, right? You do things that your grandparents and your parents tell you are wrong, what's going to happen? In the worst case scenario, you raise a bunch of eyebrows, right? It could have all kinds of repercussions. There's always going to be ideas of what's right and wrong in every society. Why is there no science of morality in these societies? Yeah. It was, well, not all morality would have been based on divine right necessarily. Maybe ideas of divine command. Why would that not be scientific account of morality? Why not? So simply the fact that I have a moral system that does not appeal to religion, this makes it scientific? Well, what would make a morality scientific? Huh? The method used. Okay? We have now a kind of systematic method. We have a basic principle. All human beings are equal. And from this basic principle, we're going to derive the rest of our moral knowledge. We have a kind of concrete moral standard that, according to Locke, is self-evident that we can derive from experience, right? So now we have a systematic way of thinking about morality. In this sense, we have a science of morality. He talks about morality previous to the Ninth Era being like a clumsily built machine. You can tinker with it to get it to work better, but it's still never going to function as well as the perfectly designed machine. So the rights of human beings now become known, okay? And for Condorcet, this is going to have huge historical repercussions, because Condorcet thinks once people learn clearly about these natural rights that they have as human beings, they're never going to be willing to relinquish this idea. They're never going to be willing to return to the time of subservience, living under the authority of priests and of tyrants, right? So once we have this clear idea of human beings' natural rights, this idea is going to take hold in a society, and it's going to continue to spread further and further. And this is what he's saying in the other quotes that I have here on the handout, okay? So look at this third quote here. Condorcet says, "If we take a quick look at the present state of the globe, we'll see right away that in Europe, the principles of the French Constitution are already those of every enlightened man. We'll see them too widely disseminated there and too openly professed for tyrants and priests to block them from gradually penetrating the hovels of their slaves. And there they'll soon awaken the remnants of the slave's good sense and arouse in the soul of the oppressed the silent indignation that a life of humiliation and terror can't extinguish." Okay? Once these ideas are as well established as they have been in places like France or in the United States for Condorcet, these ideas can never be extinguished, and other people will learn of them and want the same kinds of rights respected, protected, defended by their governments, right? So the last passage I have from Condorcet here, he says, "Aren't all nations bound someday to approach the state of civilization reached by the peoples who are most enlightened, most free, most clear of prejudices? That is, the French and the Anglo-Americans." Okay? So here we get a distinctive idea about the Enlightenment coming from Condorcet. The Enlightenment is a process that's irreversible, and its spread is inevitable. And this is why Condorcet thinks he can write at the end of his book about the 10th era, what the future will be like. He thinks by reflecting on history, we recognize laws, regularities that are lawful about human developments, which we can imagine how these laws will continue to extend into the future, transforming human societies, making them more enlightened, okay? So in the 10th era, he says we're going to have a series of continual revolutions as people demand the recognition and respect of their basic natural rights, okay? He says these revolutions will take two forms. On the one hand, we might have popular revolutions, like the French Revolution, where the government in power is unwilling to grant these citizens these rights until it eventually has to be overthrown, destroyed, a new government put in place. On the other hand, some revolutions might be official revolutions. Governments will respond to the people's demands that their rights be recognized, and they'll cave into the pressure, and they will change themselves. So these governments can continue to exist as they allow greater and greater amounts of rights to be recognized, okay? And this is maybe the type of revolution that Immanuel Kant is preferring in his writings. So we'll turn to Kant now. We have four different readings from Kant in the Reader. I'm not sure which ones you'll read in your sections. So the first reading is an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? So here Kant is kind. He does us a favor. He tells us clearly what enlightenment is. He defines it for us, so we don't have to struggle too hard figuring out what he means by enlightenment. And this is my first quote from Kant here. He says, "Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority." And minority is not the best translation just because English usage today, when we hear minority, we think of lesser group of people, numbers-wise, like an ethnic minority or a religious minority, right? When Kant says minority, he means like the state of being a minor, right? The state of not being an adult. Better translation is probably immaturity here, okay? So enlightenment for Kant is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, okay? He thinks most people are immature, or most people live as minors in the sense that they don't think for themselves. This is what children do, right? Your parents tell you what you should wear, what you should eat, maybe what you should major in college, all these things they try to tell us. And when we're minors, that's appropriate. This is their job. They're the ones who know better what is good for us, okay? But once we're mature, once we're adults, now it is time for us to decide what is in our best interest. Yet most of us don't do this. And Kant says this is self-incurred. We cause our own immaturity. Why? Because we're afraid to think for ourselves, or we're unwilling to put in the hard work to think for ourselves. When someone becomes enlightened, this means they have the courage, the resolve to think for themselves. And in the next passage, you see him expanding upon what this means. So this comes from the second Kant reading in the packet. It's called What is Orientation in Thinking? This is one of Kant's footnotes here. Kant says, thinking for oneself means seeking the supreme touchstone of truth in oneself, i.e., in one's own reason. And the maxim of always thinking for oneself is enlightenment. Now, there is less to this than people imagine when they place enlightenment in the acquisition of information. For it is rather a negative principle in the use of one's faculty of cognition, and often he who is richest in information is the least enlightened in the use he makes of it. To make use of one's own reason means no more than to ask oneself, whenever one is supposed to assume something, whether one could find it feasible to make the ground or the rule on which one assumes it into a universal principle for the use of reason. So here, Kant is distinguishing between the idea of enlightenment in the sense of being able to think for oneself and enlightenment in the sense of knowing lots of information, right? I think this is a difference between the way we see Condorcet talking about enlightenment. Condorcet seems to identify enlightenment with having the right beliefs, right? Knowing the right things. Where Kant is saying it has much more to do with how one is thinking, namely that one is thinking for themselves, okay? So I want to try to expand on what was probably an obscure passage that I just read there. So enlightenment for Kant is the state of thinking for oneself, or the process of learning to think for oneself. At the end, he had this language of thinking for yourself means that whenever you're going to act on something, you want it to be acting on some kind of, his exact language here was a universal principle, okay? And that might not be the clearest phrasing to some of you. So I think he does a pretty good job of explaining what he means in another of our contexts. This is called the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, okay? So what Kant argues in this text is that people, if they want to understand how to be good, this does not require any kind of special education or special training. You don't have to go to seminary. You don't even have to go to college. You don't even have to have good parents or good family members looking over you. All of us are capable of understanding how to live rightly, how to do what is good. And we're capable of doing this because we all possess reason. Reason by itself commands us. It shows us what it is to act rightly in every situation, okay? So how does reason do this? Kant says to be good simply means one thing. It means that you have a good will. To have a good will for Kant means that you're acting purely for the sake of fulfilling your moral duty. This is the only reason why you're acting. You're acting just in order to fulfill your moral duty. Now, when we behave morally, that might not be the reason why we act, right? Kant gives the example of facing the decision of whether or not you should lie, for example, on a loan application. You would like to get a new house, you're graduating from college, you don't have a good job, you don't have good income. If you tell them what your economic status is, they're probably not going to give you a loan, and then you're not going to get a house, and that'll be sad. So wouldn't you be a lot better off if you just lied on the loan application, told them you're the CEO of Google, something like this? Then you'll get all kinds of money, get any kind of house you want, right? So we have a question. Should I lie on the loan application or not? Moral question, okay? Now, I might choose to do the right thing, assuming the right thing is telling the truth, okay? But there's different reasons why I might choose to do the right thing. I might choose to do the right thing only because I'm afraid of the consequences of getting caught. If I lie on my application and they catch me, I could be fined, I could be put in jail, right? This could harm my overall credit score, these kinds of things. So that might be the reason why I choose to tell the truth. simply because I fear the consequences of getting caught. On the other hand, I might decide to tell the truth just because lying makes me feel bad. Some people are like this. They don't feel good when they lie to others. My wife's like this, right? I tell her, don't tell my parents we're moving to Beirut. They're just going to get scared and say ignorant things. Tell them we're going to Nebraska or something, you know? And she's like, I can't lie to them. Why not? I lie to them all the time. What are you talking about? They actually think I love them. Some people feel bad when they lie. But if that's the reason that you're deciding to tell the truth, Kant would say this is not a moral reason. The only moral reason for telling the truth is that you recognize it is wrong to lie. So you're fulfilling your duty. I recognize it is wrong to lie, therefore I will not lie, regardless of the consequences, regardless of how it makes me feel. Okay? This is the only true moral reason for acting because this is the only reliable moral reason for acting. If the consequences were such that I could not get caught, and I knew that I could not get caught, then I should lie if I'm reasoning on the basis of consequences. If I'm the kind of person who feels good when I lie, then I should lie if I'm reasoning on the basis of my feeling. But if I'm simply acting to fulfill my moral duty, then lying is wrong, regardless of how I feel, regardless of what the consequences are. So this is why being good means having a good will. And Kant thinks all of us, since we are thinking rational beings, we have the good will, or the potentiality for a good will, okay? Reason can tell us what we should do. We just need to figure out, if you like, how to listen to it or how to hear it. And Kant proposes a test that will always show us the right way to act. And we can call this test, or principle, his word, the principle of universalizability, okay? So the principle of universalizability is basically this idea. Act only on maxims that can be made universal laws and are still achievable. A maxim, I'm just using this word because Kant does, so you know what he's talking about. A maxim is basically a principle of action. So for any given action, we have some reason for doing it, okay? This is the principle underlying the action. Your maxim, your principle of action, will always have two parts. It will tell you what you're doing, and it will tell you why you're doing it, okay? So anytime I'm wondering whether or not I should perform an action, I need to first lay out my maxim. What am I doing and why am I doing it? And then I need to ask, if this maxim was universalized, that is, if everyone in the world acted on this maxim, could I still achieve my goal? If everyone in the world acted on this maxim and I could still achieve my goal, well, that means this is a moral action. It's permissible. But if everyone in the world was to act on this maxim and I could not achieve my goal, that means it's immoral. That means it's impermissible. Okay? Reason shows me this. So if we go back to the maxim, what am I doing? I'm lying on a loan application. Why am I doing it? In order to get a loan. Does this pass the test of universalizability? If everyone in the world acted this way, could I still achieve my goal? What do you think, Zainab? So you're saying I couldn't achieve my goal because if everyone's lying, everyone's going to get a loan, and then by the time I'm there in the loan office, they're out of money. That's your reasoning? We agree with Zainab? This is the problem? Probably bankers aren't as dumb as we might think. Probably long before they ran out of all the money, they would recognize everyone's lying, and then they'd stop giving out the money. They'd stop trusting the loan applications. Either way, I'm not going to be able to get my loan. So this means this action is immoral. Okay, I understand that this maxim does not pass the test of universalizability, but why exactly is it immoral? Any idea? Well, that doesn't seem to have anything to do with this test, right? This test is supposed to show me that this action is immoral. So what's the connection between this test and the moral status of lying on a loan? Yeah. Okay, this is Kant's reasoning. So Karim's point, I'll say it so you can hear. Karim said the problem here is, in order for my plan to work, right? In order for my plan to work, for me to lie on this loan and to get money, what has to happen is everyone else has to follow the rules and I get to break them, right? My plan's only going to work if other people are truthful on their loan applications and I get to lie. And Kant would say what I'm doing there is I'm treating myself by different standards than I'm treating others, okay? I'm being inconsistent. And this is why reason can always show us what moral behavior is. Because reason demands, if nothing else, reason demands consistency, right? You can't believe a contradiction. Reason will not allow you to say, I am older than 10 years old and I am younger than 10 years old. That statement is nonsense, okay? And reason is also telling you that this proposal for moral behavior is also nonsense because it's treating people inconsistently. It's holding you to a different standard than it is everyone else. If your maxim is universalizable and you can still achieve your goal, the reason it's moral is because everyone can do the same thing, right? So you're treating everyone consistently. So if my maxim is, I will donate blood in order to save lives, is this universalizable? What do you think, Salah? Yes? Everyone could donate blood to save lives and I could still donate blood to save lives, achieving my goal? Well, if everyone's donating blood, they might not need me to donate blood. That's true. But my goal is to save lives, right? So my goal's still being achieved. And I still can't donate blood, and it can be frozen and stored for later, right? Nothing to prevent that. So here we have an action that is universalizable, and I can still achieve my goal. Kant would say this is moral, okay? So subtle difference, but maybe important difference between Kant and Condorcet. Like I said, Condorcet is focusing on what we actually believe if we're enlightened, whereas Kant focuses on how we arrive at our beliefs, okay? Now, Kant, like Condorcet, is also going to accept ideas of the rights of human beings and defend them, okay? However, if you were to follow Kant's technique of thinking, it's possible that you could arrive at totally different kinds of conclusions. So, just to give one sort of naughty counterexample of how the principle of universalizability can fail, okay? Muhammad, do you think genocide is a bad thing? Yeah. It took you too long to say that. Okay, genocide seems like a bad thing, not a moral thing, okay? Does this pass the test of universalizability? I will kill an American in order to erase Americans from the earth. If everyone else acted on this maxim, could I achieve my goal? Yes. Well, that seems to be like a problem, right? If this is supposed to be the test that allows us to see what beliefs are moral or not moral. Now, Kant would have a response to this, but the only point I'm trying to emphasize is when we're focusing on the way in which we arrive at beliefs as what constitutes enlightenment, right? We could end up at really different outcomes as to what the beliefs enlightened persons hold might be, okay? So, lastly, I want to look at our critic quickly. Johann Gottfried Herder. He is a student of Kant who becomes a bad boy, rebel critic of the Enlightenment. His work, this too is a philosophy of history. What he's interested in here, you can maybe guess by the title, is he's interested especially in the way in which histories are or should be written. And I think if you pay attention to his writing, you'll see him criticizing a lot of the ideas that Enlightenment philosophers have been taking for granted. Now, like Condorcet, he doesn't clearly define enlightenment or enlightened thinking for us, so we need to sort of look at passages where he uses the word and speculate as to what the logical connections might be. So I have one passage here. What Herder is doing here is he's talking about the general writing of history and the way that people typically write about what Condorcet called the Ninth Era, okay? This enlightened age. So how do people typically write about this enlightened age we're living in now? Herder says, finally, this is what people say, finally there followed, as we say, the dissolution, the unfolding, long eternal night, enlightened itself into morning. There arose Reformation, Renaissance of the arts, science, ethics. The yeast sank, and there arose our thought, culture, philosophy. People began to think as we think today. People were no longer barbarians, okay? So this is a kind of tongue-in-cheek description of what many sort of Enlightenment histories are like, according to Herder. One thing you see him identifying here is this period of Enlightenment makes people like we are today, okay? So he's associating the Enlightenment here, especially with his period. He goes on, he says, no temporal point in the unfolding of the human spirit has been more beautifully described than this, since all our histories and philosophies point to it and know how to draw towards it as the highest peak of human civilization. Okay? Now, in a sense, it would be unfair to say that Condor claimed that he was living during the highest peak of civilization because he himself emphasizes how much work needs to be done in the future. This is what his 10th era is all about, even in his own homeland when he talks about the rights of women and these sorts of things, okay? But it is maybe fair to say that Condorcet would say that he is living in the most advanced progressive time that we have heretofore seen in the course of human history, okay? Last passage from Herder. He says, at the same time, when the earth has been at the same time, when has the earth been as universally enlightened as now, and constantly proceeds to become more enlightened? And how this seems to advance further and further. Whither do European colonies not reach, and whither will they not reach? Everywhere the savages, the more they become fond of our brandy and luxury, become ripe for our conversion too. Everywhere approach, especially through brandy and luxury, our culture. Will soon, God help us, all human beings be like us, good, strong, happy human beings? Okay? So what you'll see when you read Herder, I think, in many ways it's a critique or criticism that's similar to one we saw in Rousseau. For Rousseau, when human beings, as he would say, are perfecting themselves or improving themselves, this is always coming with a cost, right? As they're developing new skills, they're losing old ones. Right? So he talks about losing the robustness that the body had in the state of nature, right? As human beings perfect themselves with better technologies and these sorts of things. Herder has a similar kind of criticism of Enlightenment, I think. As societies are becoming more enlightened and advancing or progressing in some ways, they're also losing other important ways of life, okay? So Herder talks about Enlightenment as a kind of modern mechanical style of thinking that takes contemporary European cultural standards as the measure of humanity. So a word about what he means by mechanical thinking. Here, I think he has in mind the kind of systematic thinking that we've been focusing on as a hallmark of modern thinking, right? For Herder, he says the spirit of modern philosophy is mechanics, right? Making everything machine-like, systematic in this sense. And one of the things that he believes happens when thinking becomes systematic or mechanical like this is we lose our ability for original thinking, okay? So this is one of the consequences of the development of enlightened thought. We lose the capacity for original forms of thinking. Why? Because this great new set of modern philosophers have revealed to us what the foundations of knowledge are, or what the foundations of ethics are, or what the foundations of beauty are. And we memorize these basic principles, these basic rules, and then we go about applying them to the world around us, right? And we end up doing exactly what the early modern philosophers were telling us not to do, right? Just imitating the kind of inherited knowledge of the people we learn from. So we also end up losing our capacity for critical thinking. Herder especially notices this when we're studying people of other cultures. So if I follow Condorcet and I think that basic human equality is the foundation of morality, well, now when I study other societies, every time I see some kind of practice that doesn't treat others as equal, I'm going to quickly recognize that they're violating the basic foundation of morality and their ethics are somehow corrupted, somehow wrong, right, in need of fixing, okay? And what Herder would say is, before we're going to criticize a people, we first need to understand and be able to sympathize with them. We need to understand why they would think these behaviors are good. We might end up still criticizing them at the end, but if we can't first try to understand why they thought these behaviors are good, then we're not really critically reflecting on our own moral principles. All we're doing is we're reinforcing the prejudice that we began with when we started studying these other peoples. And reinforcing prejudice is the opposite of critical thinking. Ethics. In many works of modern Enlightenment philosophers, ethics is taught as the sort of instruction of moral principles, basic moral beliefs, moral foundations. And the problem with this model of ethics, Herder thinks, is it's never actually going to change the world because moral principles don't actually have force. If you want to change the way people think and behave, you need to change their habits and their inclinations, their tendencies to act, their tendencies to feel. This is why the United States can claim that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, yet they still have slavery for over 100 years. Because that principle, all men are created equal, does not change the way that people think and act and feel. This takes practice, right? But the modern thinkers, Enlightenment thinkers, are ignoring this, okay? And lastly, the study of history itself. History itself, he'll say, requires this sympathetic understanding of other peoples. We're going to have to question what the future of history, what the future of humanity will be like. We can't pretend to know what the 10th era will appear to be, like Condorcet says, okay? I went a minute over. I sincerely apologize. Thank you.